Okay, we'll get started now with the session. Our first speaker is Nancy Wilkins-Diehr, who many of you know, and she's going to give, I think, a very interesting and unique take on measuring impact on science gateways based on a whole lot of viewpoints that I hope you find very interesting. Nancy?
Thanks, Mike. Good afternoon, everybody. A bridge tale of 15 gateways in 30 minutes. Probably half of you in the audience are co-authors on this, I know. But we felt it was important to talk to a lot of gateways and kind of develop an understanding of what measuring impact can mean in a lot of different ways. I was at Kirk Key's talk in one of the sessions this morning where he was talking about factors that affect the uptake of the use of cyber infrastructure. And one of the things he said was just because things are obvious doesn't mean that people do them. So I think you'll kind of see that throughout this talk. Some of the ways of measuring impact are obvious, but I think it's also helpful to have the very many ways of doing this kind of laid out in front of you when you're first designing a gateway so that you can think about what relates to you and what's important and what's not. Okay, so. Yeah, a little bit small print for the back of the room there. Decided to present this, kind of like a book format because there was just so very much content, but I'm going to talk through the key points, so don't worry about, reading all the fine print, and also the paper that's got much more details is already up on OSF so that you can all find it. So these are some of the gateways that we featured. What I started with was clients of SGCI. So a next step in this work is to reach out to international gateway developers. If we get invited to submit a longer journal article on this topic, that's what we're going to do, is incorporate more perspectives. But this started out with SGCI clients. So those of you in the room have heard a lot about SGCI at this conference, so I don't have to go through this this a lot. But in our work, helping gateways improve what they offer, impact measurements has been kind of a key part of that work. And I already mentioned the international perspectives. So I'm going to go kind of one by one through these gateways. So the ULTRASCAN gateway, NIH and NSF supported gateway, and it allows users to use analytical ultracentrifugation software remotely. And so they use this software and they use ultracentrifuges to understand more about material properties in a lot of different domains. So this gateway has been in operation for quite some time. And what's important to them, you start with the very basic metrics. How many users do you have? What institutions are they from? What publications result? And here you think about the difference between asking users to submit publications and being proactive and going out and scouring Google Scholar, and you'll see gateways that have different approaches to that going forward. So the IPT gateway, this is Ritu Arora out of TAC. So this is an education-based gateway. So it's a little bit easier to measure impact because you have student learning goals. So they can take tests at the end of using the gateway. They're looking at whether they can learn parallel programming techniques more quickly by using this gateway than they can at the command line. And also important to them is the usage of their resources. So they want to see 70% usage of the software and the hardware resources that they have access to in this gateway. So the SeedMe is a more data-related gateway and helps researchers solve the last mile problem in sharing data and metadata. And what you'll see in their metrics of success are not just the numbers of users, but the size of the data items and the way users are able to collaborate. So they're thinking, what led them to design this gateway at the outset? It was to overcome these problems, sharing very large data sets among collaborators. So you want to make sure when you're looking at your metrics that you're able to capture what those initial goals were. And you'll see that come up kind of in a couple of different projects along the way here. CyNeuro gateway. This is a neuroscience-based gateway, but also with an education focus. So what's interesting here is that what they would like their user community to be able to do is create these openly accessible software tools. So what you'll see in their impact measurements are the numbers of users, of course, but also things like entries in Git, new research teaching tools, sustainable software products openly available in Git, publishing learning outcomes, so not just publications, but looking at these learning outcomes. And so kind of thinking carefully about what the goals are. So, you know, your gateways can do a lot of different things. For the compute heavy gateways, you're looking at number of users and maybe jobs run and resources consumed and things like that. And with some of the education gateways, you know, it's a very, there's some very different things that you're looking at. The University of South Dakota Science Gateway, they have a gateway that provides access to a new high performance computing resource that they had in the state at the time. And so what they're looking to do is support a large user community with a finite number of supporters. And this might resonate with a lot of you. So they wanted to understand how they could get the most people up and running with the least effort from their support staff. And with a particular focus on groups new to advanced computing. Because if you have folks who are familiar, they're just gonna go log on at the command line and you really don't need a gateway for that. So one of the things they have to keep in mind when they're measuring is what domain area are the groups from, what department are they from. They're supporting universities from throughout the state, so what universities are there, and also looking at classroom use of the resource. Chapter 6, Open Topography. So OT is another data collection-based science gateway, enabling fundamental discoveries using LiDAR data sets. And what they're looking at is, so they have data holdings of these LiDAR data sets. And so they're looking at partners who want to deposit their LiDAR data sets within Open Topography. And so it's seen as a success if a lot of these groups are interested in depositing their data there. So growing number of partners from government and industry, so where are these data sets coming from? But then they're also looking at algorithm development on top of those data sets, and publications you'll see as a common theme. So they look at user metrics, usage analytics. What was interesting is that some of their clients are interested in the data that they have about how users use Open Topography. So some gateways might find that there's value just in these usage metrics in and of themselves. Cypress Science Gateway. An HPC gateway allowing users access to high-end computing to run phylogenetics jobs. One of the things I thought was interesting about Cypress user metrics was that they stepped away. So Mark says, we no longer track user visits, number of users on the site, number of user accounts, because these don't correlate strongly with our intent, our goals. So what they look at is the number of users, job submissions, let's see, the rate of user turnover, which I thought was really interesting. So are people coming and staying? Are people coming and leaving? Are those things good or bad? Country and institution, so that you can understand whether you're serving only leading research institutions, whether you're serving those as well as teaching institutions, whether you have a worldwide impact. Thinking about all those things at the outset. User sentiment through surveys. There are a number of gateways that do annual surveys. That can be effective. I think that you can also understand user behavior by looking at, if there's high turnover and your users aren't coming back. You don't need a survey to tell you that there's something wrong and that maybe something that you ought to fix. They're also proactive, looking at Web of Science, Google Scholar, in addition to just self-reporting publications and things. So kind of going out there and doing your own digging for results. QUBES, so those of us in the education session this morning heard a nice presentation about this from Drew. So this is a very education-related gateway. That's the primary function of this gateway. And what's important to them is the demographics of their participants, institution types, geographic distribution. So you want to think carefully at the beginning of your gateway design about what you're going to want to know, because it can sometimes be difficult to go back and get geographic distribution if all you're collecting is a Gmail address and a password and things like that. So you don't want to over collect information on your users, but you want to make sure you have enough to tell you what you want to know. The number of times QUBES is written into grants. This is interesting. A lot of gateways aren't designed in ways that they can be written into grants. Some of them are. But if that's important, making sure that you can monitor that. And then the generation of other resources for others to use for education and the uptake by the broader community. So quite different than a straight CPU kind of gateway. We have the EQA gateway from Hawaii, groundwater, water management gateway. And what's interesting here is that, so the number and quality of annotated data sets and data products, but also the growth in users external to the university. So even though this originates out of Hawaii and the initial envisioned user community was folks on the island, there's value in use by those outside. And so that was something that was important to Sean. And so kind of understanding where the users are coming from. And then also, and we'll see this in another gateway, not just the use of the data and tools, but how the use of that affects policy and management actions. So those things can be very difficult and expensive to understand sometimes. So how, so making sure you can follow the train of how the gateway was used and then what those end impacts were. And I'll give you an example in another couple of gateways about one group who undertook very in-depth case studies to understand kind of exactly this sort of thing. It's actually this next gateway, Greg Newman's citizenscience.org. So this is a framework for others to use to develop their own citizen science projects. So you use citsci.org and you've got all the underpinnings to launch your own citizen science project, no matter what that is. And so some of the things that they look at is, because they provide this platform for all these projects to use, and they house all the data, they can find out, they know how active a citizen science project is. So they know how many observations are being made, how many people are using a particular citizen science gateway. But what they wanted to understand, so that's one measure of success, obviously. If there's nothing happening there, there are problems. But they wanted to look a little more deeply. So how are, because we hear a lot about citizen science projects, and then, and for some you wonder what the impact really can be. And so what Greg and his group looked at is number of decision-making policies informed, the degree to which participants are being impacted through the metrics of scientific literacy. So how is the public appreciating science more because they're participating in these things? But especially the policy decisions, they undertook some very detailed case studies to understand, for just because they have, I think, 760 different citizen science projects. So you're not going to be able to analyze all of them, but you can do a few in depth. And so in this paper, we have a reference to Greg's more in-depth case study to look at the policy impact. And they learned things like the citizen science projects that are more locally focused tend to have a greater impact on policy decisions than ones that are, you know, maybe nationwide observations of birds or things like that. So the local had more policy impact. But it's, you know, important to think about all the different things that you think could be success metrics for a gateway, including, you know, the public scientific literacy is, can be a difficult to measure metric. So CyberGIS is looking at high-end cyber infrastructure to solve geographic information science projects. This is Xiaowen Wang out of UIUC. And they're looking at measuring the progress of science teams, so the number of science teams, the variety, journal papers, but also things like dissertations, data production, software production, publications, students, courses, tutorials. So kind of thinking about that, that very large umbrella of what impact can mean. Data Discovery Studio. This is Ilya Zaslavsky out of the San Diego Supercomputer Center. So also looking at data. And so I think it was kind of interesting in this collection of 15 gateways how you had a nice mix of both compute and data and how the metrics differ between those. And so what's important here is what they're doing is they're collecting a large number of different earth science data sets and making it easier to search across all those different data sets. So quantifying search improvements. So they do a lot of focus testing. This, I think, is something that's really important. I know that usability has been one of the very highly valued services that SGCI offers. So not just end user surveys, but doing some of this shoulder surfing focus testing to find out if their gateway has really made it easier to navigate these, you know, 1.6 million data resources from 40 different repositories. So they're kind of this umbrella organization, and are things really easier to find? So that's one of their primary metrics. COSMICZ out of Michigan. This is a gateway that provides high performance computing for cryo-electron microscopy calculations. And one thing that makes the metrics a little bit easier to measure for this is, you know, not just the usage and the computing and that sort of thing, but the end goal is depositing these new samples in the electron microscopy data bank. So like the protein data bank. So you can actually count these samples that get deposited coming from this gateway. So that's a really nice kind of contained thing that Mike Cianfranco's got to be able to look at success here. Also, let's see, new users, emphasis on new users. So they're looking at outreach and their ability to kind of diversify the user community in this area. You have a lot of scientists who aren't HPC savvy, dealing with all of a sudden 10 to 20 terabyte data sets. So kind of looking at that measurement as well. Almost up to number 15. So SIMCCS is looking at carbon capture and, you know, climate impact mitigation systems. And one thing that they're looking at is, so they're after an international user base in energy research and policy communities. So you know what you need to be capturing about your user communities to know whether you're achieving that goal. And I think that one thing to keep in mind is that your metrics can change over time, your goals can change over time. I think this group was surprised by the degree of private sector interest in their gateway. And so now they're looking at being able to meet the needs of this user community, but it also means you have to be able to identify the fact that they came from private sector. QUAHSI, HYDROSHARE, David Tarboton out of Utah State. Also a data-related science gateway. So they're looking at Also, you know, similar to Cypress in that they want a mix of both new users, indicating that there's greater interest in these services, as well as returning users. So you've got deeper adoption and people tackling more and more difficult problems using this. One of the things I thought was interesting about HYDROSHARE is that, and I think Data Discovery Studio might be doing this also, so they publish DOIs for HYDROSHARE resources, and they use this Claravit Data Citation Index so that they can track papers that reference resources from within HYDROSHARE. So kind of putting those hooks, if you're offering especially data resources, putting those hooks into the gateway design early on so that you can do this kind of tracking later on. They also look at launches of the different apps, and some of the gateways have the ability to run them via APIs as well as through the web interfaces. So kind of looking at those kinds of interfaces also. So looking at these, at so many different projects, I mean, some of this, you know, to Kirk's point, some of this, while it might be obvious, I feel it's important to be able to look at the big picture and think about all the different types of metrics that there might be, because it can sometimes be difficult to sit in a vacuum and think, well, you know, I know about the initial goals for my gateway, but you might be overlooking things, and to have kind of a laundry list that far exceeds what you personally would want to measure and just say, you know, yes, 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 no, no, helps you develop kind of a bigger picture so that, you know, at the beginning you can capture some of these things. Capturing is one thing, and then telling those success stories when you have those metrics and telling those things over and over, that can really help you build user community. It can really help you build relationships with funding agencies. I think you can't tell those kinds of success stories strongly enough and often enough, and a lot of gateways fail to do that. They get really excited about the technology developments and putting things out there, but you sort of forget about the rest of it and really telling those stories strongly. So you got the simple things, the user types and the counts. Then you've got user behavior. What are they doing? Are they pushing on the upper limits of your gateway? You really put this out there so that they could connect like 5 different data resources as well as compute. Are they doing that, or are they just doing simpler things? So it's kind of their behavior. Satisfaction, are they able to do things faster? That's a goal of a lot of gateways. How do you measure that? Do you ask them? And then the longer term impacts, which are the harder to measure. Publications, of course, but those are usually, you know, months or years after the fact. So they're a bit of a lagging indicator. And then really looking at the influence on policy decisions, on, you know, size of repositories, you know, electron microscopy repositories, those sorts of things. I think I talked through most of those things. Right, are people using the gateway in the way you design complex usage patterns? Yeah. Yeah, so publications is easy, but also educational materials developed, software products, Git repositories, sharing by others. That was kind of a common goal of a lot of gateways. So our interdisciplinary groups advancing their work because of the Data Discovery Studio, for example. Think about your goals, establish the means to collect, publicize, and adapt the metrics over time, and be prepared to change. That's funny, because this is not the slides I've saved. I thought they looked a little bit different in the beginning. That's really odd. I think I just reformatted these a little bit. Last slide. Thank you very much for those of you who were here at the intro. You know that I've recently retired, so this is presenting work that was developed earlier this year while I was still working. This was me a couple of days ago in the Sierras, and when I say thank you, this isn't just like a regular slide thank you. I want to sincerely thank this community for all you've done to develop the Gateway idea over these last many years, and wish you lots of success in the future. I'll keep my eye on things and occasionally pop in at a conference maybe, but really I want to thank all of you in this room for what you've done for the community. It's very gratifying to come here and see everything so vibrant and so many people here and interested in Science Gateway. So, questions?
We do have time for questions. Anybody have a question? I have a question. The question you would maybe expect me to ask is, are we ever going to have a standard set of metrics that we can define all Gateway success by in terms of impact? But I think the question I want to ask is, would that be maybe one of the most dangerous things we could do, in the sense that it may prematurely or artificially end certain Gateway efforts that have importance that may not be judgeable on the same level of importance as maybe major disciplines that we see today?
Right.
How do you feel about that on our field as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, we were pleased to tackle this topic because I think it's important to have some kind of framework and some kind of, you know, laundry list to pick and choose from. It's certainly not going to be the same across gateways. And in some instances, high user counts isn't even the goal. You know, if you've got, you know, 5 Nobel Prize winners who are using your science gateway, and maybe you're not doing so poorly, you know, so there's depth as well. But I don't know, I think, thinking at a high level about the types of impact that the gateways can have beyond just activity, you know, is I think important. But yeah, I agree. If you have a fixed set, you're going to limit. Yeah, I mean, things are always changing. You're going to limit what, yeah, the success.
So more of a suggestion than a question. One of the things that I know we struggle with is how to report this stuff, not just collecting it, but is it infographics? Is it putting up annual reports or things like that? So it'd be interesting to see kind of what people are doing on that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one thing that we were thinking about in SGCI is we have this gateway catalog that's got like several hundred different gateways in it. And so there could be part of those entries that have metrics of success, which could make it easy to like search those things. But I think you're right. I mean, you absolutely want graphics on a website, because that is so compelling to new users, to funders, when you're out giving talks, showing the activity, you know, the maps of who's logged on in the last so many, you know, all those sorts of things. They really help, and they really help tell a story. And when you're trying to grow audience and things like that, really showing that success, you can't do that too much. I mean, so yeah, having good examples of how to do that, I think, is a great way that SGCI could contribute also. Thank you.